The disappearances at Stonehenge have long since transformed into legends whispered across the mist-covered fields of Wiltshire. Local pubs ring with tales of vanished tourists, missing archaeologists, and tour groups that never returned to their coaches. But what if one day, among those who disappear forever, you find someone you love? Someone whose absence tears a hole in the fabric of your world that can never be mended. Today's story is deeply personal. It's about a school class that never came home, about a brother whose laughter was silenced in an instant, about a father who chose sacrifice over surrender, and about the ancient secrets buried beneath the earth in chambers older than memory where time flows differently and the living becomes something else entirely. This is a story about choices whose echoes resound through decades. You're listening to What If You Never Existed?
Chapter 1. The Day the Bus Never Returned. I'll remember that October day of 1994 forever. Not because something special happened to me, but because it didn't. I was 9 years old, lying in bed with a high fever, cursing my illness. Outside my bedroom window, I could see my classmates gathering at the school gates, backpacks on their shoulders, excited about the upcoming trip. My brother Jamie was 12. He was in 7th grade, and their group was heading to Stonehenge for an archaeological excursion. It was a special program, a 2-day immersion in history, with an overnight stay at a youth hostel near the ancient stones. Jamie was thrilled. He was fascinated by history, read books about Celts and Druids, drew pictures of mysterious rituals. I was supposed to go too, as part of a program for younger students who could join the older ones. But the night before the trip, I was struck down by a vicious fever. Mum took my temperature, 102.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The trip was cancelled for me. "Don't be upset, Tommy," Jamie said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "I'll bring you something special. Maybe I'll find a real druidic artifact." He smiled, and his eyes sparkled with anticipation of adventure. It was the last smile of my brother's that I would ever see. The bus left the school at exactly 8 in the morning. I watched from my window as the yellow school bus turned the corner and disappeared from view. Inside were 24 students, teacher Mrs. Harrison and driver Mr. Thompson. 26 people who were supposed to return the next day by 6 in the evening. But they never returned. At first, everyone thought it was a simple delay. Mom nervously glanced at the clock as the hand passed 7. At 7:30, she called the school. The principal said he was contacting the hostel. At 8:30, it turned out the group had left the hostel that morning on schedule. By 9 that evening, the police were involved. The next 3 days turned into a nightmare. Police combed the entire route between Stonehenge and our town. They checked every gas station, every roadside motel, every hospital within a 100-mile radius. Helicopters circled over forests and fields. Divers searched every pond and river. Nothing. The bus had vanished as if it had dissolved into thin air. On the 4th day, Father came home. He worked as a geologist and often traveled on business trips. Mom met him at the door, and I saw her face contort with grief as she told him what had happened. Father listened in silence. Then he went to his study and pulled out old maps, military topographic maps of Wiltshire that he had been collecting for years. He spread them on the table and began studying them, making notes with a red pencil. "What are you doing?" Mom asked. "The police are searching on the surface," he replied, without taking his eyes off the maps. "But what if they need to be looked for below?" He pointed to the area around Stonehenge, crisscrossed with circles and arrows. "Under this land is a labyrinth, ancient quarries, natural caves, artificial tunnels. Some of them aren't marked on any modern map. I'm going there." Mom tried to dissuade him. The police said they would continue the search, but Father was adamant. "If they're alive, time is running out," he said. "If they're dead, I want to know the truth." On the 5th day after the disappearance, Father packed a backpack, took an old army lamp, maps, and a metal detector. He kissed us goodbye and said, "If I don't return in a week, give these maps to the police. Tell them I was right about the underground passages." He got in his Jeep and drove away. That was the last we heard from him. Chapter 2. 20 years of searching. 2 decades passed. Mom never recovered from the double blow, losing first one son, then her husband. She withered like a flower without sun and died of cancer when I turned 25. Before her death, she whispered, "Find them, Tommy. Find them and bring them home." I tried to live a normal life, finished university, got a degree in journalism, worked for the local newspaper. But every night, I had the same dreams: Stonehenge in the fog, ancient stones with children's silhouettes flickering between them, and Jamie's voice calling my name. "Tommy, come here." I found what I was looking for. I began my own investigation. I went through police archives, met with witnesses, studied the history of disappearances around Stonehenge. It turned out people had been vanishing there for centuries. The first written mentions dated back to the 14th century. A chronicle by a monk from Salisbury Cathedral described the disappearance of an entire village near the pagan stones. In the 18th century, a team of surveyors mapping the area for a new lord of the manor disappeared. In the 1920s, a group of archaeologists from Cambridge. In the 1960s, hippies who had set up camp at the foot of the stones. Every time, no traces, no clues. But the most interesting thing I discovered was in the diaries of a Victorian antiquarian named Reginald Fitzwilliam. In 1887, he spent several months studying Stonehenge and made an astonishing entry. The locals avoid talking about the stones after sunset. Old Shepherd William Thatcher told me a strange story. He claims the stones are just the tip of a huge underground temple. According to him, miles of corridors and chambers carved into the rock stretch beneath the earth, hewn before the Romans came. He calls this place the Gates Between Worlds and swears he has seen people enter a secret entrance at Blackwater Farm and never return. Blackwater Farm. I found it on Father's old maps, an abandoned farm 3 miles northeast of Stonehenge. Now only ruins and an old barn remained. I went there on a sunny April day in 2014, 20 years after my brother's disappearance. The farm ruins were overgrown with ivy and brambles, but the barn stood solid, a massive stone structure with thick walls. Inside, I found what I was looking for. In the far corner, under a pile of rotted hay and old boards, I discovered a hatch, a heavy oak cover reinforced with iron, with a massive lock. The lock was modern, no older than 10 years. Someone had specifically sealed this entrance. I broke the lock with a crowbar and opened the hatch. From the darkness below came cold air and a strange smell, a mixture of mold, dampness, and something metallic. But beneath these familiar underground aromas lurked something else, something that made my skin crawl. The smell of time, the smell of something very ancient and very wrong. Chapter 3. In the depths beneath Stonehenge. I descended the stone steps with a powerful flashlight in hand. The steps were worn by thousands of feet, polished to a shine. Some stones were covered with strange symbols, not Roman, not Celtic, but something much more ancient. The tunnel led deep underground at a steep angle. The walls were carved from living rock and covered with black moss that glowed pale green in the flashlight beam. The air grew colder with each step. My breath turned to vapor, and the sound of footsteps echoed strangely, as if the tunnel were much larger than it appeared. After half an hour of descent, I reached a fork. The tunnel split into 3 directions, and on the wall was carved a map, a diagram of the underground labyrinth covering the area beneath all of Stonehenge. Hundreds of corridors, chambers, halls. In the center of the diagram was a large circle with a symbol I couldn't decipher. I chose the middle tunnel, marking my path with chalk on the walls. I walked for another hour until I heard a sound. At first I thought it was wind, but then I realized someone was singing, a children's choir. Quiet, barely audible, but recognizable. My heart began to beat faster. I quickened my pace, following the sound. The tunnel led me to a huge hall. The ceiling was lost in darkness, and the walls were covered with bas-reliefs, scenes of some ancient rituals. Figures in long robes surrounded altars on which motionless bodies lay. But that's not what made me stop dead in my tracks. Along the walls, in niches carved into the rock, stood children. 24 figures in school uniforms, motionless, with their hands at their sides. Their faces were pale, waxy, but recognizable. Jamie's class, every last one, and among them, my brother. He looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, a 12-year-old boy with tousled chestnut hair and freckles on his nose. But in his eyes, there was no time, only a bottomless void that reflected the light of my flashlight. "Jamie," I whispered. He turned his head, slowly, mechanically, looked at me, and smiled. That same smile I remembered, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold parody of human emotion. "Tommy," he said, in a voice that was both his voice and not his at the same time. "You finally came. I've been waiting so long." He took a step forward. The other children also began to move, emerging from their niches. Their movements were synchronized, like dolls controlled by a single puppeteer. "Stay with us," Jamie said. "It's good here. Time has no power here. We can play forever." He reached out his hand to me, and I saw that his skin was covered with the same greenish patterns as the moss on the walls, as if something was growing from within. And then Father stepped out of the shadows. Chapter 4. the guardian between worlds. Father had aged. His hair had turned grey, his face was lined with wrinkles, but his eyes burned with the same determined fire as 20 years ago. Around his neck hung an ancient amulet, a medallion darkened with age, with engraved symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Don't move, Tommy," he said quietly, but authoritatively, touching the amulet on his chest. "And don't listen to him. That's not your brother. Not anymore." "Dad?" I could barely believe my eyes. "You're alive? What's happening here?" "I've been holding them," he replied, not taking his eyes off the children who had stopped as if commanded. "For 20 years now, but I'm not sure if it's really necessary or if I've just gone mad." "What do you mean?" Father shook his head, and I saw doubt in his eyes. "The first years I was certain. I saw them trying to rise to the surface, felt their alien will. But over time, maybe it's all a figment of my imagination. Maybe I just couldn't come to terms with their death." "But why? What happened to them?" Father thought for a moment. "Something under Stonehenge sleeps, something ancient, older than people, older than time. It feeds on life force, but doesn't kill immediately, transforms the living into conduits of its will. Children are ideal vessels, pure, unprotected." He pointed to the bas-reliefs on the walls. The Druids knew about this. Stonehenge wasn't built to worship the sun. It was built as a prison. The stones above are the lock, and these halls are the cell. "Then why are the children still here?" "Because someone broke the seals." Father's voice trembled with anger. "In the 1960s, archaeologists found one of the entrances. They thought they were making the discovery of the century. They opened ancient barriers, and it awakened." Jamie took another step forward, and Father instinctively squeezed the amulet. But nothing happened. No hum, no magical force. "See," Father whispered. "Maybe the amulet never did anything. Maybe I just believed." "He can't hold us forever," Jamie said, and now his voice carried echoes of something inhuman. "He's aging, weakening. Soon we'll rise to the surface, and then the whole world will know our songs." "But what if you're wrong?" I asked. "What if they really are dangerous?" "Then when I die," Father said quietly, "the world will find out. If they rise and nothing happens, then I've lived 20 years in an illusion. But if what I think begins..." He didn't finish the sentence. "And if you can't stop them with the amulet, how have you been keeping them here?" Father pondered. "Maybe they just didn't want to leave. Maybe something about this place holds them here for other reasons, or they're already dead, and I'm talking to hallucinations." Chapter 5: The Choice Between Worlds. The next few hours, Father told me about his doubts. The amulet came to him from an old farmer who claimed it protected against underground spirits. But in 20 years, Father had never seen any proof of its power. "Maybe the children just stayed here," he said. "Maybe they died in a tunnel collapse, and I created an entire mythology to explain their presence. But they move, they speak. Or I think they speak. Tommy, I've lived alone in an underground chamber for 20 years. The mind can play strange tricks." We established a shift system. I went up to the surface for supplies while Father continued his vigil. Gradually, I learned to feel the presence of the ancient entity, a cold, alien will that pressed on the mind, trying to find a crack. But the hardest part was meetings with Jamie. Every day, he tried to convince me to join them. He told me about the wonders they would show the world, about the end of all diseases and suffering, about the eternity that awaited those who accepted the gift. "You can save everyone, Tommy," he said. "Mom didn't have to die of cancer. Nobody has to die. We can change that." Sometimes his arguments seemed almost convincing, but then I remembered his empty eyes and understood that this wasn't salvation. It was replacing humanity with something else. A year passed. Father grew weaker. His hair turned completely gray, and his hands trembled from the strain of constant concentration. "Soon, you'll have to stay here alone," he said one day, "and then you'll decide for yourself. Continue my mission, or just leave. Let's see what happens." "What will happen to the children if I leave?" "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe they'll just decay, as the dead should. Or maybe—" He didn't finish. I understood that Father wanted me to make the choice myself. Stay and continue his vigil, or leave and test whether his fears were justified. That night, I had a dream. I stood on the surface near Stonehenge and saw an army of children rising from underground. They walked across fields and roads, their songs carried by the wind. And everywhere these songs sounded, people stopped, listened, and joined the procession. I woke up in a cold sweat, gripping the amulet tighter. Epilogue: The Endless Watch. 5 years have passed since I first descended into the underground chambers of Stonehenge. Father died 3 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, after our last conversation about what was real and what was a product of imagination. I buried him in one of the side chambers, and then I got my answer. A week after his death, the children disappeared. They simply dissolved like mist at dawn. No traces, no remains, only empty niches in the walls. So Father was right, but not in the way he thought. It wasn't ancient magic or a sinister entity. It was something else, something that required the presence of a living person to maintain the illusion. Now I'm alone in the empty halls. Every day I come down here and wait. I wait to see if they'll appear again. I wait for a sign that Father's fears were justified. So far, nothing. Only the echo of my footsteps and memories of the 20 years Father spent in voluntary imprisonment, guarding the world from a threat that perhaps existed only in his head. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I think I hear children's voices, distant, barely distinguishable. And then I understand. Maybe Father wasn't insane. Maybe his presence really was restraining something. Or maybe now, that role has passed to me. Every year, on the anniversary of the class's disappearance, I receive a letter. No return address, no signature, 3 words. "We're still waiting." Who sends them? I don't know. Perhaps it's someone's cruel joke. Perhaps not. I don't know if my father was a hero or a madman. I don't know if I'm protecting the world or just living in an illusion like he did. But I stay, because the cost of being wrong might be too high, and so I stand between two possibilities, between reality and madness, between threat and phantom. And in this uncertainty, perhaps, lies the true horror. Sometimes choice isn't salvation. Sometimes choice is eternal vigilance between the known and unknown, between what is and what might be. Maybe there are still guardians. Maybe someone still stands watch from within.
The catacombs beneath Stonehenge may not be empty. Perhaps right now, as you listen to this story, someone stands in the darkness with an amulet in hand, keeping something ancient and hungry from awakening. Someone who sacrificed their life so you could live yours. Think about it the next time you see photos of Stonehenge. Those stones aren't just a monument to the past. Perhaps they're still fulfilling their original function. Perhaps they still stand guard. You've been listening to What If You Never Existed. Until next time, if we're lucky.